This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi guys, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 26, James Biel. Illinois mother Kara Witkowski, who joins me on today's episode, spent months trying to protect her two young children from harm while in the care of their father. Thomas Biel had confessed to raping and abusing Kara and was under investigation for possessing child pornography. His father, Jerry Biel, was being investigated for allegedly molesting Kara's 3-year-old daughter. Despite months of warnings from Kara, meticulous documentation backing up her claims, and the repeated hospitalization of her toddler son for a prolapsed rectum so severe that even surgery didn't correct it, a family court judge granted full custody to Thomas Biel. Soon afterward, Kara's 2-year-old son, James, died under suspicious circumstances while in the care of his father's family, but police announced after less than 24 hours, even before an autopsy was performed, that there had been no foul play. Even though an independent second autopsy proved that spinal trauma caused James's death, there has still been no investigation. This is a story of corruption and injustice in Kane County, Illinois. This is the infuriating story of James Biel. My sources for this week are the Chicago Sun-Times, Patch.com, CBS 2 Chicago, the Daily Caller, Journal and Topics, the Justice for James Facebook page, Northwest Liberty News, and Kara Witkowski. For this episode, I had a few lengthy conversations with James's mom, Kara. I'm going to mix up my usual format just a little bit today and intersperse my narrative with parts of those conversations. Hearing Kara tell this story is very compelling. Fair warning, this story is going to enrage you. It involves corruption in the family court system, the utter failure of a child protection agency, and either ineptitude, malfeasance, or both within law enforcement. On top of that, the story itself is born of domestic abuse, likely personality disorders, and child sexual abuse. It's a minefield of maddening information and total injustice. And I urge you, when you're finished listening to this episode, to share this story with everyone you know and tell them to do the same. The only way to get justice for James and to make a difference in his mother and sister's lives is to spread awareness and hope a surge of public outrage will pressure the systems and agencies involved to right their wrongs. We've seen DCS failures before. We've seen cases in which one parent is treated unfairly by the family court system. And we've seen cases in which the police are either inept or corrupt. Rarely do we see a case in which all of those things took place simultaneously, and very rarely do we see one as egregious or infuriating as this case. I'm far from a conspiracy theorist, but I've spent days poring over all the evidence in this case, and this reeks of a cover-up. All signs point to a massive cancer of corruption in Kane County, Illinois, from the family court system, Judge John G. Dalton and Attorney Julie Pirtle in particular, to Illinois DCFS, to the Palatine Police Department. What exactly is being covered up, I can't say, but I can think of no other reason why there's been no investigation into this baby's death, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Let's get into it. Trick-or-treating was over for most kids who were home with their stashes of candy by 9:50 p.m. on Thursday, October 31st, 2019, when police responded to a medical emergency in the 1300 block of East Evergreen Drive, located in northwest suburban Palatine, Illinois. Inside the house, 2-year-old James Riker Biel was unresponsive on his grandfather's bed, although neither the boy's grandfather, Jerry Biel, nor Jerry's wife, Helena, seemed to know what had happened to him. They said James had been on Jerry's bed playing with an electronic device when Helena left the room to take a shower. When she returned, she thought James was sleeping, but she noticed her grandson's lips were blue. James's father, then 31-year-old Thomas Jerry Biel, told police he had left for work at 9:35 p.m., at which time, by his account, James was healthy and responsive. In the police report, a small red bubble is noted as coming out of James's nostril, in addition to red-colored foam present in his mouth. His tongue was also swollen, and there was a cut on his lip. James was rushed to Northwest Community Hospital in the nearby city of Arlington Heights, but tragically it was too late. Despite the efforts of paramedics and medical staff, James Riker Biel, who had just celebrated his second birthday on October 6th, was pronounced dead at 10:34 p.m. James's mother, now 24-year-old Kara Witkowski of Elgin, Illinois, later said, "Holding his lifeless body and staring into a face I knew I would not be able to breathe life into was the most painful and heart-shattering experience of my life." Within 24 hours before an autopsy was even conducted and with next to no investigation, the Palatine Police Department decided that foul play was not suspected. How and why could they have possibly known that without investigating? To properly tell this story, we need to go back to the beginning. Kara Witkowski and Thomas Biel were together for about 5 years and had 2 children together, a daughter born in August of 2015, and James Riker Biel, who was born on October 6, 2017. According to Kara, throughout her entire relationship with Tom, he was abusive, both physically and psychologically.
Throughout those 5 years, there was definitely a lot of psychological and emotional abuse. And, there was a lot of him, telling me to kill myself and using my PTSD against me and using the kids against me, basically telling me that, I wasn't a good mother and I'd never be a good mother, that my daughter didn't even like me. He's putting a lot of negative things into my head and making me completely and totally reliant on him.
In August of 2018, the relationship took a turn for the worse when Kara said Tom raped her for the first time.
And that was the first time he had raped and sodomized me. I was in my bedroom and I was on my phone and I was about to go to sleep. I heard him coming in the door. He came in the door. He grabbed me. He held me down. He inserted his penis inside of me, anally without any lubricant or anything. He shoved my head into the pillow. I started screaming and crying, and I tried to pull myself out from under him, and I remember trying to turn my head to the side and eventually just looking at a window, still struggling. He told me to shut the fuck up. He threw my head down again into the pillow. When he was done, he looked at me and he asked me how I enjoyed my anal rape, and at that point, I was so stunned I didn't even say anything. I just ran into the bathroom, and I told a friend about what had happened. The next day, I confronted him, and I told him what had happened and what he did to me. He said that it was because he had experienced trauma when he was a kid, and that, he was sexually abused as a kid, and that he was sorry that had happened, and that he wanted to be better, and he told me he was going to go into therapy, and he told me he was going to get help.
He told her at that time that he suffered from dissociative personality disorder, or DID, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. Throughout the remainder of their relationship, Tom's abuse of Kara escalated. Finally, on March 19, 2019, he raped her again, which is evidenced by screenshots of messages between Kara and Tom, in which he freely admits to his crimes. I'll include those screenshots as well as other documentation from the case in the Facebook photo album for this episode.
It was pretty much the same thing. I was in my room, about to go to sleep. He came in the door. He threw his shoes off, threw his clothes off. He grabbed me. He told me that he was going to put me in the attic, and he was going to lock the attic if I didn't do what he wanted me to do. And he jammed himself again inside of me anally. And I tried to pull myself from under him, and I kept screaming at him to get off. And I just remember crying and pleading with him and telling him how much pain I was in. and everything was muffled because my face was in a pillow. And when he was done, he said he had to go to work. I went into the bathroom, and I heard him come into the bathroom. He had fecal matter on his fingers from the assault. He was washing his hands, and he flicked the water with the fecal matter in my face. And then he left for work and said nothing to me. At which point I contacted some friends. I wrote into a PTSD group. He had found out that I wrote in the PTSD group. He contacted me. He started telling me that I was going to ruin his life, and the police were involved, and I was scared what would happen when he was going to come home. And I told him, that everything was fine, and I hadn't used the specific word rape in the post. I had just described what happened, and he kept telling me to take the post down. So, anyways, he had been threatening to kill me, and I contacted my friend who was in New Hampshire, and she told me that she could get us out safely and we could stay with her. So I made plans to do that, and was just kind of biding my time and trying to keep things calm while we were still together. So on the 22nd, I was at work, and my boss was actually the one who was going to take me to the airport, and they knew about the plan as well. So Tom was dropping off James, because I take James with me always to work, and I watch James at work. When he dropped off James, he kept telling me to get into the car alone with him, and I wouldn't go into the car alone with him. And my boss came out, and her other family members came out. My client was out there as well, and he said in front of everybody, how could you do the one thing that would make me kill myself? And I was like, what are you talking about? He told me, that he saw the messages and he knew what I was planning on doing. And I just broke down in tears, and I said, well, you keep raping me and threatening to kill me. What was I supposed to do? And he told me that if he was going, he would not be the only one going. Basically threatening my life, the kids' lives, and his own life. And my boss told him again to leave, and her husband told him to leave, and he did leave. He called me on my phone. I went into the bathroom to take his call. And he told me that now that we weren't together anymore, he could tell me the truth. He told me that he had never gone to therapy. And this was incredible to me, because he had actually taken me to the place where he supposedly was going to therapy. And I waited outside the car for him for an hour to finish his session, which makes me wonder what actually was he doing if he wasn't in therapy. And he told me, that he didn't have multiple personality disorder. They just made that up to keep assaulting me. And after hearing all this, all my sympathy, all my empathy was gone for him. And I couldn't bear, even thinking about what he did to me, because it was full-on assault, and he got pleasure out of it.
In their messages, Kara asked if the children were in danger, and Tom said that he was probably a greater danger to the kids than to her, because he cared more about her than he did about them, essentially admitting he saw the children as property. Afraid for the lives of herself and her kids, Kara reported the most recent assault to the Elgin Police Department on March 22, 2019, providing them with the messages in which Tom admitted to his criminal behavior. At that point, the police department notified DCFS of the situation.
So when I went to the police, I gave them everything I had. They ended up arresting him. They never fingerprinted him. They never charged him. They never tried to get me an order of protection. They released him like the very next day. Nobody told me he was being released except for his best friend. And his best friend told me that, Tom was on his way, basically, to my house. And I was like, no, he can't be. And I was freaking out. And the friend agreed to stay with me, knowing that Tom was at my house. He was asking me all sorts of questions about everything that was going on. And he actually took me into a room alone and really was getting in my face about who I talked to, what was going on, and just seeming very threatening and trying to get information out of me. So I was told by the police to go get an order of protection on Monday after I called them and asked them why I hadn't been notified, that he was let out and everything else. They said somebody tried to call me. I guess I just didn't get their call. I looked on my phone. I saw no such call. But there was an officer that later came by to the house that evening and dropped off paperwork for me, which wasn't even correctly filled out. And he he told me, I'm sorry, and he just kept shaking his head, and he kept saying, I'm so sorry. And I was like, am I going to have to share custody with my rapist? And he goes, I hope not. And he was the one that told me to go get the order of protection. So I went and I got the emergency order of protection on Monday because I couldn't do it the next day because he was arrested on a Friday. He was released on a Saturday. I had to wait 2 days to get the order of protection. And I'll never forget what the judge said to me. He told me that if he didn't sign the order of protection, that he didn't know what would happen to me. He was genuinely scared for my life. And that's when I first started realizing, like, something was very strange. I mean, the fact that he wasn't charged alone was strange, given all the evidence. The fact that I've never been to court for this was strange. And then you have a judge telling me, like, he's literally afraid for my life if he didn't sign this piece of paper. So I started getting, like, really nervous and not understanding exactly what was going on. I had the kids with me. While I had the kids with me, they were constantly calling wellness checks. And the cops would come over to my house. They would see that I was either at work and the kids were with babysitters, which were my roommates at the time, and nothing would ever be wrong. I mean, the kids were fine. I was fine. I was at work. There's no issue. But they called 9 times. There were 9 wellness checks done in the period of about 22 days. And this is while I had an emergency order of protection that was signed by the Kane County judge. I think his name was Peterson. Yeah, it was Judge Peterson.
Tom had been using Kara's car because, although she didn't have a license, the car was in her name because it had been bought using her credit. When the car was returned to Kara, she decided to clean it out. In the spare tire compartment beneath the floor of the trunk, Kara found a hard drive she recognized as Tom's. On that hard drive, Kara found thousands of anime images of prepubescent children and adults performing sexual acts on each other. Kara contacted Sergeant Katie Phillips of the Elgin Police Department, who asked her to bring in the drive. Sergeant Phillips also notified DCFS about the material found on the hard drive. On March 25th, Kara noticed several small bruises on the back of her 3-year-old daughter's leg. SW told her that her grandpa, Tom's father, Jerry Biel, had hit her and touched her bathing suit zone. Kara took SW to their pediatrician, who was very concerned, and contacted the Palatine police, as the alleged offenses took place at Jerry and Helena Biel's house in Palatine. Kara noted that her daughter was disturbingly comfortable with the doctor disrobing her and examining her private areas. The Palatine police opened an investigation into Jerry Biel. Kara had expressed her concern to Tom in the past about his father's treatment of their young daughter. Kara had always been uncomfortable with leaving their children alone with Jerry, especially since Tom had told her Jerry had abused him as a child, but Tom never took Kara's concerns into consideration, often leaving the children with his parents while Kara was at work. The judge presiding over the case was John G. Dalton, who has since not only recused himself from this case, but also been removed as a family court judge, instead presiding over evictions and property arbitration cases. The children were assigned a guardian ad litem named Julie Pirtle. The guardian ad litem, or GAL, is a court-appointed attorney whose job it is to investigate a case and make recommendations to the court. Their job is to work in the best interests of the child. Keep that in mind as we go forward. At a court hearing on April 11, 2019, regarding Kara's order of protection against Tom, Kara's attorney, Melissa Cuffle, brought all of Kara's evidence, including screenshots of the incriminating messages.
Fast forward to April 11th was when I went in for the plenary order of protection. My attorney, Melissa Cuffle, she had all the evidence. She had the text messages. She had everything showing that he, A, was constantly telling me to kill myself, B, that he admitted to the rape, C, that he admitted that he had no sense of ethics or morality, that he had all these personality disorders, that he admitted to being a sociopath. She had everything. And based on that, the judge granted me the 2-year order of protection without any issues. Well, the judge wanted to combine the order of protection case into a family court case, which I didn't think was a red flag. But now looking back at it, it is kind of strange because your custody judge is never typically your order of protection judge. It's 2 different types of courts. So I was told by my attorney that everything was fine. I could stay at work because she knew I had to work in order to pay her bills, and that, Tom was going to come in and they were going to do supervised visitation because that's what always gets done when there's an order of protection in place. Well, she calls me and she's like, I don't know what's going on here. I'm sorry. I don't know what is going on. They gave him unsupervised visits 4 days out of the week, 8 hours a day.
The children were scheduled to visit their father, unsupervised, about a week later.
During the unsupervised visits, my daughter came home to me. She had a dark gray-yellow bruise underneath her right butt cheek. She had scratches on the back of her legs. Her private area was really red and irritated and open. And she was telling me and my mother that Grandpa was hitting her, that Daddy was hitting James in the face, and that Grandpa was touching her bathing suit zone. And she said this on video because I had cameras around my house due to the order of protection. So I talked to my babysitter, who's also my best friend, and I was like, well, what should I do here? And her parents are cops. They all decided that I should take my daughter in and document what had happened. So we went to the police station to get, documentation of what had occurred. And based upon the photos that I showed the officer, because she had this really dark bruise on her lower back that was bright red, and she had the scratches and then the mark underneath her butt cheek, they said that we should take her to the hospital. Took her to the hospital. The doctor immediately saw the contusion, wrote down domestic concern, but didn't see a need to do any sort of rape kit or sexual assault kit, which, doctor tells me that, so I'm fine with that, and I was willing to go home. Maybe she just had, a UTI or a yeast infection or something else, and which is why the private area was red. Maybe she had a diaper rash. I don't know. But if the doctor wasn't concerned, I wasn't concerned. So I was like, okay, I'll take her home. The police kept urging me to get a rape kit done, and I said no because the doctor said it wasn't necessary. Well, the next day I'm called from Dr. Gregory of Children's Flores Hospital, and she tells me it's absolutely necessary to come in and get a rape kit done. She told me that based upon what she saw and the reports that were sent to her from the Palatine Police Department, that I needed to have this done. So I wasn't about to argue with her, and I said, fine, that's okay, I'll get it done. Then she calls me back, and she tells me there's no DCFS allegations regarding Jerry, which is Tom's dad, and that I didn't need to take her in for the rape kit. And I thought that was very odd because I literally had the paperwork with Jerry's name on it saying he was under investigation. And I told her, okay, well, I could take this to you and I could prove it to you because there definitely is paperwork for this. And she told me, okay, just bring her in.
Kara's friend wrote a letter to the court saying, when I asked SW what was wrong, she stared at me, said Grandpa hit her bathing suit zone, completely spaced out for a solid 2 minutes. Then for no reason I could find, she randomly would just yell, smile, and force a smile. She also told me that Daddy and Grandpa have been hitting her and James in the face and in the bathing suit zone. I genuinely am concerned that SW is being abused in both a physical and sexual way, and that Jerry Biel is largely the man who is abusing SW in such manners, based off of the way that SW acts and the count of times she has flat out told me about these incidents.
While this is all happening, I go to my attorney, and my attorney goes, we need to do an emergency order of protection based upon the video, based upon the hospital report, based upon your photos. We need to do an emergency motion to try to get restricted visitation, basically, or supervised visitation, whatever it is. So we went into court on April 24th, and based upon the video, based upon the photos, and the judge refused to look at anything and just granted the fact that my daughter could not be around Jerry, which was Tom's dad. Well, the problem with that was Tom was living with his dad. So his attorney piped up and said Tom was living with his dad. And when the judge heard that, he goes, oh, okay, well then, he can just go into another room when she was there. And I was like, what? And I immediately went to my attorney and go, why are you accepting this? We have to do something. She goes, we can't do anything. You need to leave it be. And again, another red flag went off. I was like, what? What is going on here? Why is nothing making sense? How could this judgment be allowed,
Also on April 25th, Palatine police closed the investigation into Jerry Biel, stemming from Kara's reports in March and April. In an email to Kara, Detective Robert Bice said, both incidents have been investigated and will be classified as unfounded. There will be no criminal charges stemming from either incident due to a lack of evidence and no corroboration of the allegations. DCFS closed the case as unfounded on their end as well. An evidentiary hearing was scheduled for May 2nd, during which Kara was not allowed to speak. No evidence was allowed to be presented, and Tom's parenting time was not restricted, despite the emergency order Judge Dalton approved against him on April 25th.
So on May 2nd, Me and my attorney went to court. None of our evidence was allowed to be presented. They wanted to actually do it into a conference, and my attorney insisted that we have it outside in the courtroom so I could see it. And the only thing that was brought up was the fact that my daughter was acting out sexually, which was brought up by Tom and his friend Larry. And then Julie started talking about my past abuse with a family member, which had nothing to do with anything that was going on. And nothing was being said about Jerry. Nothing was being said about Tom. Nothing was being said about the child pornography. Judge John G. Dalton knows there's child pornography investigation. There's an investigation against Jerry Biel. There's an investigation against Tom. There's an investigation with my ongoing rape case. You know, he knows all of these factors. He himself saw the messages where Tom admitted to raping me and knows that he raped me. And he doesn't take any of that into consideration, apparently doesn't care, and says that Tom is still going to have visits without supervision. And Tom had not even given his psych eval at this point. So I was ordered to give a psych eval. I got mine done right away. Mine said exactly what you would expect it to say, that I have PTSD, that I was abused as a child previously, that I had issues with alcohol when I was a teenager but have since stopped and don't drink at all, and that I was hospitalized in February because I did have, suicidal feelings regarding everything that was going on, and the sexual assault exacerbated my PTSD about what happened to me as a child, and I did reach a very low point, and I hospitalized myself so that I wouldn't do anything foolish and risk losing my children forever and have them losing me and not being able to be a mother to them. So I took the decision to put myself in the hospital so I could be better for them and be better for myself. And that was all used against me in court. Nothing was used against him regarding his mental health or his sex abuse that he openly admits to in text messages, but it was all used against me. After the evidentiary hearing on May 2nd, my lawyer asked me that I'd let her withdraw. She didn't want to be on the case anymore. She told me she just wanted to withdraw, that the judge wasn't listening to her. He wasn't allowing evidence to be presented. She didn't see a way to win the case. She just wanted to withdraw. I go, no, I can't do that. I still need you. An attorney is better than no attorney. She sent me a letter saying that I need to pay her $1,000 a month in order to keep her, which I couldn't afford as a CNA and someone paying my attorney bills by myself. I couldn't do it. So I told her, okay, fine, then you're just going to have to withdraw. So May 15th, that was the only thing that was supposed to happen, was she was supposed to withdraw. And I get a call from my roommates that they're there, that the police are there, that they have an order signed by the judge, and it has Julie Pirtle's name on it, and that they're there to take my kids and put them into Tom's custody. Now, mind you, I had no idea there was a court date other than the withdrawal. I was never given the emergency motion that they used. I was never able to defend myself. I was never able to do anything. And they were just there to take my kids. And I got on the phone with the cop, and I was like, what is going on? What is happening? And the cop even told me, goes, I don't know. I don't know why this is happening. I don't know what's going on. Kara, I'm going to call the FBI, but you have to give them your kids. You will go to jail if you don't do this. And I was like, well, I can't even do this right now because I'm at work. I'm with James. I take James to work with me. I can't even be there until 8 o'clock till I get off my shift. So he agreed. He told Tom and his family, who were waiting outside the door apparently, to leave. They all left. I got there at 8 o'clock. I kissed my kids goodbye. I hugged them, and I gave them over to the police so I wouldn't go to jail, basically, and lose my kids forever. And I figured, this will be a quick fix. I'll defend myself, and everything will be fine. And everything was not fine. They actually appointed my best friend, who Tom had accused previously of doing heroin, to be my court-appointed supervisor. They didn't consult her. They didn't consult me. They didn't consult my work schedule. They gave me the supervised parenting arrangement. It was like Monday through Wednesday, and it was 6 hours. I couldn't even do Mondays because I worked, and I couldn't change my work schedule at that point. The whole time that me and my court-appointed supervisor had my kids, they were constantly, well, not they, specifically, was constantly coming home with bruises. She had bruising on her buttocks, her lower back, her sides. She kept talking about being hit. She was constantly telling my supervisor she was being hit. She was telling me she was being hit. And basically anyone who would listen to her, she would tell she was being hit and she was being touched inappropriately. One of the things I remember most was her saying that Grandpa had put mommy finger and daddy finger inside of her. And she was telling this to me and my court-appointed supervisor and my roommates that were living with us at the time. She kept talking about being abused. She kept talking about being hurt. And my son, from what we saw, the first thing we noticed with him was he had a bruise on his forehead, which Tom said was discoloration. But it was a big bruise right on his forehead. It was yellow. And there was a DCFS worker already involved. And I sent her a picture of this. I also sent her the voicemail. Her name was Sophia Salas. And despite all this evidence, they closed the case in like 2 weeks. And this was an ongoing thing. I mean, people would constantly call DCFS. Cops would call DCFS. A court-appointed supervisor would call DCFS. Many mandated reporters would call DCFS, and the investigation would constantly be closed, and almost immediately it would be closed every single time and unfounded.
During a hearing on June 12th, Tom's attorney, Scott Sheen, told Judge Dalton that the child pornography investigation into Tom was closed. Kara later obtained a copy of the report, which indicated that Tom's hard drive contained 44,000 images in total relating to sex and children. A majority of these images were cartoons and were graphic sex acts between animated children and adults. 722 of the images were apparent real prepubescent children, 3 of which were nude images. The rest had on only underwear. Over 500 of these children were identified and recognized by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
August 2nd, my son was taken to the hospital for a prolapsed rectum, which, at first I was not concerned because prolapsed rectum, could be caused by constipation, it could be caused by straining. I wasn't that worried, especially if it was just a one-time thing.
According to the Boston Children's Hospital, rectal prolapse occurs when the muscles and ligaments that support the rectum become weakened. Certain factors make your child more likely to experience rectal prolapse, including straining while going to the bathroom, chronic constipation, acute or chronic diarrhea, malnutrition, cystic fibrosis, neurological conditions such as tethered cord or spinal cord injury, Hirschsprung's disease and other colorectal and pelvic malformations, anal penetrations such as from sexual abuse.
When I spoke with the nurse and she told me that he had been there since August 2nd and it was already August 5th, and she had told me that they had done surgery on him, and then she told me that it was still coming out. And then I started getting very concerned. And I was like, well, why can't this be fixed? What is going on here? And nobody would give me any answers. They just kept telling me I should come and see him. So I contacted the guardian ad litem. The guardian ad litem ignored me. She wouldn't answer my emails. She wouldn't answer my calls. Finally, I got her to answer one of my calls, and I asked to see my son, and she told me that was fine. So I went with my boss to go see my son at the hospital. They would not let me see my son. Julie Pirtle actually contacted them and said I had to have my court-appointed supervisor with me to see my son. Well, my court-appointed supervisor was with her child. She has a daughter, and she couldn't just drop everything. So my boss and I basically said, we don't care. We're coming. That's that, and go with it. Now, when we got there, a administrator that works on the pediatric floor took a half hour out of whatever she was doing to watch me with my son. Now, tell me what kind of power and what kind of clout it would take to get the hospital administrator of the entire pediatric floor to supervise you with your child. And again, that's how I knew that there was something severely messed up about this situation. So I was with my son, and he had his bottom taped together, and he was very upset. He had just had an enema when I went to see him. And then he kind of calmed down when he saw me. We had fun. We played. He was doing well. There didn't seem to be any problems. I asked the nurse if he would be staying over because I saw they have a meal plan on the wall, and then they have a meal plan that's set up for the next day. And she goes, yeah, he's going to be staying the night again because they weren't able to fix the prolapse, basically. So I was very distraught about everything that happened. They told me that they were going to have me speak with a social worker. I don't remember the social worker's name. I remember her being very young, and I remember her wearing glasses. And she was like, I asked her, I go, did you call DCFS? And she's like, well, why would I call DCFS? I go, because this is a best neglect. If you guys are saying this is caused by constipation, I already spoke with the nurse, and this constipation would have been having to be going on for months. And this was also confirmed by the doctor as well, that this constipation would have been going on for months to cause something like this to happen, this type of severe injury. And she told me, well, I don't see a reason to call DCFS. And then she told me, don't tell me how to do my job. And at that point, I was just so frustrated because she knew about the child porn. She knew about the rape. She knew about everything. So I just walked away from her because I wasn't about to get into an argument with her. So me and my boss went into the car. My boss kept telling me to call DCFS. I said they've been absolutely no help. They don't listen to police. They don't listen to me. They don't listen to my court-appointed supervisor. They close cases instantly. I don't want to deal with that. She goes, fine, then I'll call. So she called and she told them the whole story. And I get a message from Tom that James is being released from the hospital. Now this is after the nurse even told me that he was not going to be released because they hadn't fixed the problem. And I asked Tom, I go, okay, has the prolapse been fixed? And he goes, no, they just taught me how to put it back inside of him when it comes out. And I'm in like utter disbelief, especially knowing the history of this case and what these officials all know is going on here. And they're just teaching him how to put his rectum back in place and not solving the actual issue. I was livid. So I actually had visitation with my son and my daughter on August 6th. So when I had visitation with my son and my daughter was acting very strange. She was not herself. She was very upset. She was holding my son's hand while I was changing him, and she's never done this before. She's never insisted on staying with him and holding his hand while I changed him. Well, when I changed him, I noticed that his bottom was literally pulsating, like the hole was pulsating. And I became even more like concerned and just disgusted. And I quickly changed him, and we all went into the bathroom because my daughter had to go to the bathroom. Court-appointed supervisor also went with me. And my daughter goes, someone hurt James. And I go, what do you mean someone hurt James? And she told me that Grandpa put a toothbrush in James' butt and had her pull it out. She told me that he was screaming and crying, and she tried to carry him off the bed, but Grandpa pushed her down. And I looked at her in just utter disbelief, like, what did you just say? What? And she just said this so calmly, like there was no emotion in her voice. Like this was just an everyday thing. Like there was nothing weird about this. And then she just like walked away. Didn't even, I don't know, it was one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. So right away, my court appointed supervisor contacts the GAL, writes her this email. DCFS calls me to follow up about what has already been reported, asks me if there's anything to add. I tell them what my daughter has just told me, and then I drop off the kids, I think it was 3 hours later, for their visitation with Tom. Well, when I drop off the kids for their visitation with Tom, I get this call at 9 o'clock at night from Karen Johnson Wren telling me that both of my kids, I'm not allowed to see them, that this is all my fault, that they're being taken into DCFS custody, that I can't know where they are. And I keep asking her, how can you do this? What is going on? I haven't gotten any paperwork. There's a court order, allowing me to have visitation. She didn't care. She told me that she was DCFS and she could do whatever she wants, and then she hung up on me. After that, I started calling around. I contacted the Elgin police because I had been primarily dealing with them. I talked to Sergeant Regano, and he called the Elgin DCFS, and he called Rolling Meadows DCFS and a couple other places, and he found out they had no case. There's no case against me. There's no paperwork. There's no anything. So hearing this, I became immediately concerned, and I went to the Palatine Police Department. And the Palatine Police Department, I told them that I wanted to file a missing persons report, and I also wanted them to document what my daughter had told me. I said, I don't want a case about this. I just want documentation. So despite my wishes saying I only wanted documentation, they were already in the process of an investigation regarding the allegation that my daughter had said, which I didn't even know about, because apparently they were already working with DCFS on that situation, which means they would have known about the 9 hospitalizations that my son had. I was told by Tom that my son only had one hospitalization. I found out later when the hospital records were released to me because Judge Renee Cruz ordered Tom to release the records to me on our Family Wizard that my son was actually hospitalized 9 times, had multiple surgical procedures, a surgical procedure every time he was there, sometimes multiple at a time, and that he actually did have an actual surgery to put the rectum back in place permanently on the 13th. So I was talking to the officer, and I was asking him, to file the missing person's report that I didn't know where my kids were. He smugly said, well, I know where your kids are. I go, okay, well, if you know where my kids are, can I have the DCFS paperwork? Can I see the signatures? Can I see what's going on? I mean, shouldn't I be going to court for this, given there's already a court order saying I have visitation? And he was basically laughing at me the whole time and smiling and finding this, to be very, very funny that I was going through this and saying that I was not the first person to come and look for her kids and I would not be the last, which made me very uncomfortable. And I asked to speak to his sergeant, and he would not have me speak to his supervisor, which was his sergeant. And he told me that the supervisor would just say the same thing that he said to me. And I said, I want to speak to them anyway. So I did eventually speak to a supervisor, and the supervisor didn't give me any information, didn't say anything to me, and refused to give me any paperwork. So I left having no idea where my kids were and not knowing what was going on.
Meanwhile, GAL Julie Pirtle, who remember was tasked with acting in the best interests of the children, tried to get the domestic violence expert at the Elgin Police Department, who also happened to be Kara's therapist, to agree with her that Kara was the type of mother who may murder her children. According to Kara, Miss Pirtle admits that this is not due to facts or evidence, but simply based on stories she has heard. This is the same woman who ignored admissions of rape and child pornography and still recommended that my children be in the custody of Thomas. The telephone conversation with Julie Pirtle was documented by the therapist. The next day brought another court hearing, where the court itself refused to provide Kara with documentation of a safety plan.
So when we went to court, Julie Pirtle even said herself that 8 mandated reporters had contacted DCFS about my son, which I'm assuming were most likely nurses that had dealt with him at the hospital. She literally said on the court record, she goes, well, I don't know if it's a permanent condition, referring to his prolapsed rectum. She stated that his prolapsed rectum had gotten significantly worse. She stated that the investigation against Tom had been closed, even though it had only been a week, and every DCFS investigation takes 2 weeks. She tried to tell me that the kids were not with Tom. And I saw the pager that was with Tom, which means the kids were in the daycare at the courthouse. And she goes, yeah, the kids were given back to Tom. DCFS investigation is closed and everything. So I basically caught her lying about all of this in court. And again, the child pornography was brought up. Again, all the stuff was brought up. And instead of doing something to protect my kids, Judge Dalton actually decided that he wanted me to have supervised visitation with government supervision and wanted me to pay $900 a month just to see my children.
On October 9, 2019, Judge Dalton recused himself from the Biel versus Witkowski case, saying, I've given this case a lot of thought, and I've come to the conclusion that I can no longer be fair to Ms. Witkowski.
So October 9th, finally, the judge had had enough of me posting online, of me exposing him, of me providing the court transcript showing everything I was saying, and he said that he wanted to recuse himself and that he was stepping down and that the case was being transferred. The case was transferred to Judge Renee Cruz at that time. And Judge Renee Cruz was following every single one of Dalton's orders, and this is because Judge Renee Cruz is a political affiliate and a friend, a personal friend of Dalton's. So they just transferred my case to his buddy, basically. And they allowed his buddy to take on his dirty work. So he's doing all this. I put forth an emergency motion. The emergency motion was ignored. It was based upon the prolapses. It was based upon all this new information. And at the time, I only knew about the one hospitalization. October 9th was the day that he allowed the medical records to be released to me. So the emergency motion that we went on, which was like October 15th or something, had to do with how now there was 9 hospitalizations for this incident, which nobody knew about until the records had been released. So we did this emergency motion. He ignored it. Everything was ignored.
On October 18th, Julie Pirtle withdrew as the court-appointed guardian ad litem.
Julie Pirtle ended up recusing herself because I had published how her aunt was actually neighbors with the chief deputy of the Elgin Police Department and family friends. And, you know, their nephews and the chief deputy's kids were like best friends, and they all knew each other and they all hung out. And it was a huge conflict of interest. For her to be on my case, well, the Elgin police were investigating 2 major crimes, and for her to be totally on Tom's side. And she immediately, wanted out after I exposed this. And another GAL was never replaced. It was just, she was gone and that was it. And she did this even before asking for her money. So she was desperate to get off the case because she wasn't even given her money.
Less than 2 weeks later, while in his father's custody, James died. And within 24 hours, the Palatine Police Department released a statement saying they did not suspect foul play.
It was 10:30. It was 10:30 at night. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I was at work, and I got this call saying I needed to come to the hospital and that James was very sick. And I immediately found this odd, why would they now allow me to come to the hospital? Because I had to be supervised just to see my son in the other hospital. I said, what's wrong with him? And he wouldn't give me any details. I didn't even know the doctor's name. I don't remember his name. And I dropped everything, and I told my boss I had to leave, and I took a lift because I don't drive. I took a lift over to the hospital. I met my mother there. We were approached by, I don't know if she was a hospital administrator or who she was, but she basically said, come with me. And she took us into this room, and my son wasn't there. Nothing was there. Nobody was there. It was just an empty table. The doctor comes out, and he's got this sad look on his face. And I said to him, where is my son? Where is my son? And he said, I'm sorry he didn't make it. What are you talking about? What do you mean he didn't make it? I couldn't even believe what I was hearing. I said, he wasn't even sick. This is the first time. What do you mean he didn't make it? And I just kept screaming, what happened? And he said, we don't know. And he told me this story about how my son was found and his lips were blue, and he wouldn't tell me any other details. And he said, do you want to hold him? And I said yes. And he gave me my son's cold, lifeless body, and I held my son in my arms. He still had a tube in his mouth from when they were trying to resuscitate him. And his lips were blue. And I noticed these red marks on his stomach, and I immediately asked the nurse what these red marks were, because to me they almost looked like slap marks. And the nurse told me, oh, that's just what happens when someone dies. Well, these were bright red marks. They weren't purple. They weren't blue. They were bright red. And being a CNA, I've seen death before. I've seen what happens to the body, and that didn't look like livor mortis to me. The woman told me that I couldn't see my son anymore, that we need to go. My grandmother was on the way, and she said, no, you all need to leave. She asked us all to leave immediately. She said that they were having a special medical examiner coming in who was an expert, who was going to, view him, and that we had to go. So we all left, and I filed an emergency motion to try to get my daughter. And once again, Cruz didn't even listen to it. He denied it. A child literally just died, and he still denied it. There was DCFS investigation, there was a police investigation. Nobody knew what happened to my son, and he still denied the motion to get my daughter out of there. They set up another court date, I think it was a week later, and we went back into court, and I ended up getting, remind you, my kid is dead. My child died in this man's custody, and I got supervised visits granted. I had to go and be supervised with my child for 3 hours at a frickin' Barnes & Noble, which went perfect. There was no issues. Of course there wasn't any issues. And then right after that, I immediately got unsupervised. And then after that, I had another attorney, and he got me overnight, where I'm now Monday through Thursday. But just the fact that they even forced me to do supervised visits after my child dies is just unbelievable. You think that my child is safer in the hands of a man who you don't have his psych eval? To this day, no one's seen his psych eval. The only person who supposedly has his psych eval is Julie Pirtle. My attorney has subpoenaed her for her records and has still not received it. This has been a 3-month process of him trying to subpoena her for her records, and nothing has been done. He has tried to subpoena the medical records, and we still don't have those. We only have what Tom permitted us to have. Why is Tom controlling everything? Why is this allowed to keep going on? Why is it the only information I am allowed to have regarding my son's medical records through the man who James was in the custody of when he died? Just like James was in the custody of him when he experienced 9 hospitalizations and multiple surgical procedures. I don't even know how many surgical procedures it was.
An autopsy was performed by a forensic pathology fellow, a doctor in training for a specialty, named John Walsh at the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. Dr. John Walsh was certified in anatomical pathology, but not in forensic pathology, which is a requirement in the state of Illinois. He was still, for some reason, permitted to perform James's autopsy without supervision. Dr. Walsh left James's cause and manner of death undetermined, pending further investigation. You would think that if a pathologist in training who wasn't even yet fully certified to perform an autopsy wasn't able to determine the cause and manner of death of a 2-year-old, maybe the chief medical examiner would step in, right? Not in this case. On top of that, since the police, including Palatine Police Chief Dave Daigle, Commander Steve Bratcher, and Detective Mike Tully, had already made up their minds that no one was to blame and there was no foul play involved, there would be no further investigation into James's death. Ultimately, the original autopsy ruled James's manner of death natural, and the cause unknown natural causes. A death that occurs in an otherwise healthy child is categorized as sudden unexplained death in childhood, or SUDC. It's estimated that 1 in 100,000 child deaths falls under this category.
And I even asked, John Walsh, I go, did you review the medical records? He goes, that's not necessary. I go, what? You're doing an autopsy, you don't think the medical history is important? No, that's not necessary. I go, did you review the EMS report, which is one of the most important things you have to review when you're doing an autopsy? He goes, no, that wasn't necessary either. I don't know why you think that's important. Which is interesting because that's exactly what the Palatine Police told me too, that the EMS report and the medical records regarding my son were not important. To me, what it seems like is there was already a narrative that was going on. It was known what they were going to be saying and how this was going to play out. We went into court to get to say that we wanted an independent autopsy done. And my ex's attorney said that that's not something that my ex wanted, and this was based upon his objection that he didn't want it done. Well, why wouldn't you want it done if you're not guilty? Why wouldn't you want a second opinion done?
Kara was so certain that her son's death was anything but natural that she raised the money to pay for a second autopsy to be conducted about a month after James's death by a trained, licensed, properly certified independent forensic pathologist, Dr. Amanda Humans. The preliminary autopsy results showed discoloration on James's face, around his nose and upper lip, suggesting possible suffocation. Also revealed was deep muscle bruising on the baby's lower back. These injuries were not noted in the original autopsy. Dr. Humans was unable to finalize the autopsy at that time because, unbeknownst to Kara, James's brain, heart, and neck organs were removed and retained by Dr. Walsh at the medical examiner's office in Cook County. Upon hearing this, Kara called Dr. Walsh to discuss the matter.
I just wanted to know why my son's brain and his heart and his neck organs were removed and why you kept them.
So the brain and the heart were removed for expert consultation, and we hold on to them until that consultation is completed. The neck organs were removed to evaluate for evidence of trauma, and they were returned with your son.
They were not. And trust me, I know that for a fact.
Is there any particular neck organ to which you're looking for?
I was informed by the forensic pathologist who did her second opinion today that none of his neck organs are with him.
Well, let me look in his case. Yes. I saved the neck organs too because of there was the concern for like upper respiratory tract infection, potential. There was in our investigative report the like URI type symptoms. So yes, they are with us.
With the help of a civil attorney, Dr. Humans was finally permitted to examine James's organs at the office of the Cook County Medical Examiner in July of 2020, at which time she determined the cause of death was attributed to complications from a cervical spinal cord injury. She also found that he had suffered swelling in his brain and a superficial bruise on his head. Very interesting that the very parts of James to which his death could be attributed were withheld by the medical examiner's office, where an uncertified fellow performed the initial autopsy, which conveniently could not determine a cause of death. Also interesting is that Dr. John Walsh is reportedly no longer employed by the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. The type of spinal cord injury James suffered can be caused in a few ways: a fall, a vehicle accident, a sports injury, or child abuse. Clearly, James was too young for a sports injury to apply. The police report from the evening of James's death made no mention of a fall or a vehicle accident at any point prior to the baby being found unresponsive. That leaves one option. You do the math. As for manner of death, Dr. Humans' final report stated that James's death may be accidental, homicidal, or natural. She ultimately ruled it as accidental, but due to swelling in parts of the cervical spinal cord, she noted that trauma is more likely. This injury would have caused James to have difficulty breathing, which would lead to hypoxia, brain swelling, and death caused by oxygen deprivation. According to Dr. Humans' report, further investigation must be pursued to determine if neglect or abuse caused the baby's injury. As Kara wrote on Facebook, "It is imperative for the safety of my living daughter that we know what caused the trauma to James." According to Patch.com, both the Palatine Police Department and the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services have been informed of the results of the second autopsy. So far, they have continued to refuse to reopen the investigation into James's death. Why? What is being hidden? Who is being protected?
What they didn't expect was for me to raise the money for the independent examiner. They didn't expect for me to record John Walsh. And they didn't expect for me to be able to have an attorney who was willing to pay for my examiner to come out during COVID to look at organs to finish her exam. They didn't expect all of these things to happen, and they did happen. And why did they happen? Because I have nonstop been blasting and documenting exactly what has happened in this case, because I knew that if I didn't document every single thing, if I didn't have a court reporter at every single hearing and every single court date, nobody would believe me, because the story is just insane. So they never expected me to be able to afford that either, because a court reporter, let me tell you something, $150 every single time you have a court reporter. And then the transcripts, you're talking between $300 to $700 every time. I have very generous friends. I have very generous people who have supported my cause and have assisted me with those financial burdens, which I'm so very thankful for, because some of these transcripts are just incredible. And what I think it is, and this is exactly what I think it is gaslighting, trying to make me question my sanity. And I have a couple times. I had to review my documents over and over again to be like, is this really happening? Is this really going on? And then what really helped is when other people started reaching out to me and telling me their stories, and their stories were just as unbelievable and just as insane. And that's when I figured it out, that they do this on purpose. They make these stories so complex, so insane, with so many moving parts, that they're almost incomprehensible.
Just one more indignity in this seemingly endless parade of them is the fact that James was buried without Kara's knowledge, and without his brain, heart, and neck organs, in a plot owned by his father in All Saints Cemetery. There is no headstone or marker to indicate where this beloved baby boy was laid to rest. Kara is not allowed to purchase a headstone for her son because Thomas owns the plot. It is painfully obvious that James's death must be further investigated, yet the Palatine Police Department staunchly refuses to reopen the investigation. Kara has created a petition to try to have the investigation into James's death reopened. I'll include the link to the petition in the show notes. Please sign and share it. Under the Justice for James mantle, Kara organized a peaceful protest that took place on August 6th in front of the Palatine Police Department. Kara and about 30 supporters marched in front of police headquarters, holding signs and chanting, demanding the investigation be reopened. People traveled from as far away as Michigan to support Kara in her mission to obtain justice for her son. A second peaceful protest is scheduled for August 21st, 2020 from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. outside the Palatine Police Department, where Kara and the supporters of the Justice for James movement will continue to demand an investigation into James's death. For anyone willing to take part, the police department is located at North Hicks Place, 595 North Hicks Road in Palatine, Illinois. The Palatine Police Department, including Chief Dave Daigle, Commander Steve Bratcher, and Detective Mike Tully, can be reached at 847-359-9000. I will also include the link to the Justice for James Facebook page. Please like and share the page on Facebook for updates and so much detail and documentation about the case. I deeply admire Kara's perseverance in not allowing the abuse of her children and the death of her son to be swept under the rug. Even at the age of just 24, her strength and her ability to stand tall and fight for her kids, and now for justice, is beyond inspiring. I do want to take a moment to remember James as the adorable, playful little guy he was. Kara said that James, who could make anyone smile, was the sweetest little boy with an incredible personality. She said he really enjoyed playing with his sister, dancing and singing. He loved the song Baby Shark, and he was highly adventurous and increasingly curious. Speaking with CBS 2, Kara said, "He absolutely loved monsters. I just miss that so much. I miss being able to hold him."
He was an extremely special child. He was a pure, lovable, sweet little boy. Whenever anybody would see him or hold him, their face would immediately light up, because he had something special about him where, if you were with him and you were part of his life, you just knew that everything was going to be okay and everything was going to work out, because he was just this gift to the world.
James deserves justice. We cannot rest until his death is investigated. Again, I'll include the links to the petition and the Justice for James page in the show notes. Please share them and this episode as far and wide as you can. That's it for this week, guys. Join me next week for another case. If you like the show, please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. And please subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildren.pod@gmail.com. You can also subscribe on YouTube by searching Suffer the Little Children Podcast. Visit the website at www.sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes and become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter at STLCpod. View photos related to today's case on Facebook and Instagram. Read more about today's case and many others at sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast was written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music. Other music and sound effects for the show were created using sounds from audiojungle.net. Hug your babies a bit closer tonight. Until next week, bye guys.